In this video, we're going to look at some of the other data that you could collect and use to enhance your carbon footprint and get a broader understanding of what your impacts are. Now, there's a lot we can look at. We're going to have a quick look at all of the different categories that are represented in the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, but we're going to concentrate on the top two here. So the things you buy, procurement, and the deliveries of your goods and services, if that applies to you. So procurement, as I say, might be raw materials you're buying, it could be services you're buying, or it could be more capital items like buying machinery, constructing new buildings, or buying vehicles perhaps. And then deliveries works both ways. So it could be the deliveries that come to you from your suppliers, or it could be you sending products and services out to your customers. As I mentioned, there's some other areas that we're going to touch on, but they are much more complex, and I just want you to be aware of them at this stage, but we're not going to go into them in any detail. So let's just start by taking a quick look back at the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. So this is the governing processes that we use to produce a carbon footprint. And what we're talking about here are impacts that are mostly sat in these blue areas. So our different parts of Scope 3. So we're particularly going to think on this video today about transportation distribution, which sits in both upstream and downstream. We're going to think about capital goods, and we're going to talk about purchased goods and services. We've got two slides here which just summarize and provide a bit more detail about all 15 of the Scope 3 categories that define in the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. Now, don't worry, we're not going to go through these line by line. The ones that are in italics on this page and the next page are the ones we're going to cover, but I just wanted you to have something that you can look at your leisure and understand these in a bit more detail. It's really useful background reading, whether it's for your footprint now or perhaps in the future. Also, just wanted to quickly think about and illustrate why it's important to think about these wider impacts. So this is a real life example of a carbon footprint. If this company was only measuring its scope 1 and its scope 2, so for them that's natural gas and electricity as scope 2, they would be concerned about their electricity, the red, the scope 2, 3/4 of their carbon footprint. But if we then look at the impact of conducting a more complex scope 3 measurement, getting much more into their more detailed data, what we see for them is suddenly that electricity, the 72%, becomes almost insignificant at just 3% of their overall footprint. And when we look a bit deeper into that organization's footprint, we can see that the bulk of their impacts, 32%, are in the events that they run. There's a lot of business travel, quite big impacts from hosting IT services, and then some other bits of procurement and purchases of equipment and furniture and things before we get round to that electricity as a small green slice at just 3%. And this is the same view, but this time for a consultancy firm. Now, this company outsources a lot of its work to external colleagues, and we can see over half of their footprint is made up by those external factors, and then some of those other things, data hosting and printing and accounting, and electricity being a tiny, tiny bit. So really, really important. We can get to a lot of data very quickly when we start to get into these other aspects. So it's really important that you organize your data carefully. So a couple of things you can do. One is use our data collection template. So it's an example here of the transportation slide in there. So if you go onto the site, you'll be able to download this template. But we'd also really encourage you to set really good folder structures up in whether you're using SharePoint, Teams, something else. We'd recommend you keep raw data and processed data separately because you can what you don't want to do is find that you've corrupted your raw data when you're manipulating data to input. So let's just have a look in a bit more detail at these 2 or 3 different aspects. So the first one, things you buy, your procurement stream. So the source information for you here, the main source of information is going to be your purchase ledger, your account system. That will list all of the things that you've bought as a business, and your finance team will be able to help you and provide an extract from that. Now, some carbon software, you can just import that extract or you can link it dynamically with your accounting system, which can be really useful and speed the process up. If you can't do that, then we need to do a bit of manipulation with that data, and we'll be looking at particularly focusing on where the biggest spend is. If you spent thousands of pounds on something, and that's your biggest piece of expenditure for your business, then that's the one we want to be looking at in particular. We're less concerned if you spent £3 or £4 here or there. So very often we'll start by looking at spend to give us a sense, because it's easy. The finance system has got that data in, how much you spent on raw materials or equipment or buying in external services. If we find some of those areas are really significant, what we'll then do is probably get you to look at them in a bit more detail. So let's pick an example. So you're buying a lot of, your purchase ledger shows that you're buying a lot of construction materials. Excuse me. So what we might do if we think that's going to be a really big impact area is we'd look at that in a bit more detail. So we might go and look at that construction, see, well, actually, there's an awful lot of wood in there, but we can get the kilograms of wood that we bought, and perhaps we even know what type of wood, whether it's a softwood or a hardwood. So that information might come from supplier invoices or contracts or even talking directly with suppliers. But that would give you much more accurate data. But as I said, we start with spend data. It helps us see where those hotspots are. When we look at the next area, so this is delivery data, so transportation data, again, we can start with how much you spent, because that data should be readily available either from the finance system or perhaps from delivery information, a portal, or talking to your suppliers. So at the simplest level, you might know that you spent X hundred, X thousand, X tens of thousands of pounds on couriers, and you can put that information in, and different footprint tools will have different things you can apply that to, whether that's, say, Royal Mail or DHL, or simply that it was by lorries, or it might be an average. If you, again, it starts to be something that's very significant, or you can look at your business and go, actually, you know what, we're a manufacturing business. We import a lot of materials from China or somewhere else in the world. We know transportation is going to be big. So rather than look at spend for that, what we might try and get to is a thing we call ton kilometers, which is where we're looking at how far a ton of material has been moved. So let's say we're doing that timber example again. You might be able to look at some of the information you have from your transportation partners, and it will clearly say that they've shipped 5,000 tons of wood from a port in, let's say, China again, to a port in the UK, and they can tell you that it's travelled 10,000 kilometres. So then you can multiply those together to get the ton kilometres, and that's really, really good data that we can put into a tool. But you'll know your business and a sense of whether or not these are likely to be significant or important. Then the final one was just some of these other more specific and technical aspects that might apply to certain businesses, certainly not all. So it might be that the goods you produce go on for some further processing with somebody else before they become a final product, and you might want to represent that in your footprint. It might be there are impacts in the use phase. So Pucker T years ago were doing a detailed assessment, and what they identified by looking at this was one of the most significant parts of the impact of one of their tea bags was actually the boiling the water in your kettle to make your cup of tea. So that's the use phase of the tea bag. So they were able to then use that to give some really good advice to customers around: boil only the water you need to use. Boil it once, don't walk away and come back and boil it again. The other one in here is end of life. So this might be where you're once a consumer is finished with your product, so what happens to it next? Does it go to landfill? Does it get reused? That has a significant carbon impact too, so you might measure that. Then the final one I mentioned here is significant investments. So this will only really apply to very significant amounts of money. We're talking tens of millions of pounds. So if your company has that sort of level of money invested, again, it's worth having a look at that, because you can represent that and the impact of how that's invested. Is it invested in fossil fuels or renewable energy? So your data sources for these are primarily going to be very specific, possibly bespoke. So it might be internal or external research, or it might be talking with your suppliers. But I think my top tip around this one would be, it is complex. You might need some external help and guidance on this one, so do reach out. We've got a lot of experience of helping companies with this. Good luck.